An old man lies on a bed in a foreign country, and he knows he is dying. The room smells of Egyptian spice and river water. 12 grown men stand around him, and every one of them is his son. He has waited 147 years to say what he is about to say. His name is Jacob. You know him better as Israel, the name God gave him after a night of wrestling on a riverbank that left him limping for the rest of his life. And now, with his last strength, he is going to speak a blessing and a warning over each of his sons, one by one, and those words will decide the shape of a nation that does not exist yet. You are about to watch that nation split into 12 pieces, and then watch history try to swallow 10 of those pieces whole. Some tribes will conquer kingdoms. One will vanish so completely that its name gets left off a list in the last book of the Bible. And one, the smallest and most stubborn, will outlast the empire that destroyed everyone else. This is not a story about genealogy. This is not a story about a map with 12 colored regions on it. This is a story about promise, fracture, and the question that has followed the Jewish people for 27 centuries. Where did they go? Let's start where it starts, with one man and 4 wives and 12 sons who did not get along. Jacob had 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, and 2 servants who bore him children as well, Bilhah and Zilpah. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, because the rivalry between Leah and Rachel is the reason there are 12 tribes in the first place, and not 2 or 3. Leah was unloved and fertile. Rachel was loved, and for years, barren. You can imagine the tension in that household. Sisters married to the same man, competing not for his affection, but for his children, because a child was the only currency either of them had. Leah names her first 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Rachel, desperate, gives Jacob her servant Bilhah, who bears Dan and Naphtali. Leah answers by giving her servant Zilpah, who bears Gad and Asher. Leah has 2 more sons of her own, Issachar and Zebulun. And finally, after years of waiting, Rachel herself gives birth to Joseph, the son Jacob loves most, and the son whose brothers will hate him for it. Here's what most people miss about this family. It was not a peaceful dynasty. It was jealousy, favoritism, and at least one act of violence so severe that Jacob mentions it on his deathbed. When Joseph is 17, his brothers, sick of his dreams and his coat and his father's obvious favoritism, sell him into slavery in Egypt and tell their father a wild animal killed him. Reuben, the firstborn, tries to stop it and fails. Judah is the one who suggests selling him rather than killing him outright. That single decision, made out of something between mercy and greed, ends up saving the entire family 2 decades later, when famine strikes Canaan, and it turns out the brother they sold is now the second most powerful man in Egypt. That's the backstory. Now watch what Jacob does with it at the end of his life. He does not bless his sons equally. Reuben, the firstborn, should get the double inheritance and the leadership of the family. Instead, Jacob strips him of it, punishment for an old betrayal, sleeping with one of his father's concubines. Simeon and Levi get cursed together, condemned to be scattered among the other tribes for a massacre they carried out years earlier in the city of Shechem. And then Jacob turns to Judah, the 4th son, the one who suggested selling Joseph instead of killing him, and gives him something extraordinary. He says the scepter will not depart from Judah, that kings will come from this line, and that the nations themselves will one day obey him. In Hebrew, the word for that blessing is barakah, and it is not a wish. It is a legal transfer of destiny, spoken by a dying patriarch, and ancient Israelites believed it could not be taken back once spoken. Stay with me, because this is the moment everything downstream depends on. Judah, not the firstborn, not the favorite, but the 4th son who once suggested human trafficking as the lesser evil, becomes the tribe that will produce King David, and centuries later, according to the Gospels, a carpenter's son born in a town called Bethlehem. Joseph gets his own strange honor. Because he saved the family from famine, Jacob elevates him above his brothers by splitting his inheritance in two. His sons Ephraim and Manasseh each become the head of their own tribe. That's why, when you count tribal territories later in the story, you'll find 13 names on the ground, even though there were only 12 sons. Joseph effectively becomes two tribes for the price of one. So here's where you stand at the end of Genesis. 12 sons, 2 of them cursed, 1 elevated into 2 tribes, 1 given the crown, a single dysfunctional family that God has promised will become, in his words, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. It doesn't look like that promise yet. It looks like 70 people moving to Egypt to escape a famine. 400 years pass, and this is where it gets remarkable. By the time Moses leads their descendants out of Egypt, that family of 70 has become a nation of roughly 2 million people, organized by tribe, camped by tribe, marching through the wilderness by tribe. Every tribe has its own flag, its own leader, its own place around the tabernacle. The tribe of Levi, the same tribe cursed by Jacob for violence, has been transformed into the priesthood. Here's the detail almost nobody points out. The curse of being scattered among Israel became, under Moses, a blessing in disguise. Because the Levites had no single homeland, they were sent to live in 48 cities spread across every other tribe's territory, which meant every Israelite family, no matter where they lived, had access to a priest. What looked like punishment turned into infrastructure. When Joshua finally leads the conquest of Canaan, roughly 1400 years before Christ, the land gets carved up according to that same tribal structure Jacob started on his deathbed. Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh settle east of the Jordan River, in the grazing country of Gilead. They had massive herds of cattle and asked Moses for that land specifically because it suited livestock. Judah takes the largest, toughest territory in the south. Benjamin gets a small strip wedged between Judah and Joseph's descendants, containing 2 cities that will matter enormously later, Jerusalem and Jericho. Ephraim and the other half of Manasseh take the fertile hill country in the center, and up north, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, Issachar settle the land stretching toward the Sea of Galilee. Levi, once again, gets no territory of its own, just those 48 scattered cities. The priesthood doesn't own land. It belongs to God, and it lives among everyone. There's one more thing you need to know before this story turns dark, and it's about a tribe most people can't even name if you ask them cold. The tribe of Dan. Dan was originally allotted a small strip of land west of Jerusalem, near the Mediterranean coast, but they couldn't hold it. The Philistines were too strong there. So the tribe of Dan did something no other tribe did. They picked up and migrated en masse to the far north, to a city called Lachish, near the headwaters of the Jordan, and they renamed it Dan after themselves. Remember that migration. Remember that Dan was a tribe that would not stay where it was put. Because much later, long after Dan has vanished from the historical record, a strange gap appears in a New Testament list of the 12 tribes, and Dan is the name that's missing. We'll get to that, but not yet. Now here's where the promise starts to fracture. For a while, Israel is united under 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. David, from the tribe of Judah, conquers Jerusalem and makes it his capital. Solomon builds the temple. It's the high watermark of the whole nation, wealth and peace and international reputation. And then Solomon dies, and it falls apart in a single conversation. His son Rehoboam inherits the throne, and the northern tribes come to him with a request. Lighten the heavy labor and taxation Solomon put on us, and we'll follow you. Rehoboam's older advisors tell him to say yes. His young friends, the ones he grew up with, tell him to say no, to tell the people his little finger will be thicker than his father's whole body. Rehoboam, astonishingly, listens to the young friends. 10 tribes revolt on the spot and crown a man named Jeroboam as their own king. Only Judah and Benjamin stay loyal to David's line, with Levites scattered through both kingdoms because, remember, they never had their own territory to begin with. Here's what most people miss about that moment. This wasn't a foreign invasion. This wasn't Egypt or Assyria tearing the nation apart. 12 brothers who once stood around their father's deathbed had, 7 or 8 generations later, split themselves in two over a labor dispute and a bad political decision by an arrogant young king. The kingdom of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, and the kingdom of Judah in the south now exist as two separate, often hostile nations. And Israel, the northern kingdom, does not do well. 19 kings in just over 2 centuries, and not one of them is remembered as righteous. The prophets Elijah, Elisha, Amos, and Hosea all warn the northern kingdom that judgment is coming. Hosea in particular pleads with them, using the imagery of a marriage falling apart. God as the faithful husband, Israel as the wife who keeps chasing after other lovers, other gods, foreign alliances, empty idols made of gold calves in the cities of Bethel and Dan. They don't listen, and this is where you need to pay attention to this, because what happens next erases 10 tribes from the pages of recorded history almost overnight. In the year 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire, one of the most brutal military machines the ancient world had ever produced, finishes what it started nearly a decade earlier. The Assyrian king Sargon II, following on from a siege begun by his predecessor, conquers Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom. The Assyrians do not simply defeat Israel, they deport it. Thousands upon thousands of Israelites are marched east, resettled in Halah, in Gozan by the river Habor, in the cities of the Medes, foreign lands, foreign languages, foreign gods, and in their place, the Assyrians bring in other conquered peoples to resettle the land of Israel, mixing populations so thoroughly that rebellion becomes nearly impossible. It's a strategy the Assyrians used deliberately, again and again, on every people they crushed. The book of 2 Kings summarizes the whole catastrophe in one devastating line. Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria, until this day. 10 tribes, Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, and both halves of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, scatter into an empire so vast that within a few generations, nobody can say for certain where any of them are anymore. This is the origin of a phrase you've probably heard even if you didn't know where it came from: the 10 lost tribes of Israel. But here's the part nobody tells you. Lost doesn't mean forgotten, and it doesn't mean gone. More than 700 years after Samaria fell, a Jewish historian named Josephus, writing for a Roman audience, trying to explain his own people to the empire that had just crushed a Jewish revolt in his lifetime, makes a claim that stops you in your tracks. In his book Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus writes that only 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, live under Roman rule in his day. But the other 10, he says, are beyond the Euphrates River still, an immense multitude, he writes, not to be numbered, not extinct, not assimilated into nothing, still out there, in the territory of the Parthian Empire, generations after the Assyrians first marched them into exile. Think about what that means. A first-century historian, writing from first-hand knowledge of the Jewish world of his day, believed the 10 tribes hadn't disappeared at all. They had simply become too large, too scattered, and too far east to count. Now, while all of that is happening to the north, watch what's happening to the south, to the 2 tribes who stayed loyal to David's throne. Because their story does not end the same way, and the difference matters enormously. Judah survives Assyria. In fact, Assyria besieges Jerusalem itself under King Hezekiah, and, according to the biblical account, fails to take it, a story so dramatic that the Assyrian king Sennacherib's own royal records, carved in stone and preserved to this day, boast that he shut Hezekiah up like a bird in a cage, which is a remarkable admission, because it's an Assyrian king bragging about a siege he never actually won. Judah gets a reprieve, but it's not permanent. A little over a century later, A new empire rises, Babylon, and this time, Judah does not escape. In 586 BC, the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem, burned Solomon's temple to the ground, and dragged the population of Judah into exile as well. For a moment, it looks like the entire promise made to Jacob's 12 sons is about to end in total erasure. Every tribe, north and south, scattered or destroyed. And this is not a story about total loss. This is not a story about a promise that finally failed. This is a story about a tribe that came back. 50 years later, the Persian king Cyrus conquers Babylon and does something almost no ancient conqueror ever did. He lets the exiled peoples go home and rebuild their temples. Tens of thousands of Judah's descendants return to Jerusalem. They rebuild the temple, they rebuild the walls, and over the following centuries, the very word Jew, from Yehudi, meaning belonging to Judah, becomes the name for the entire surviving remnant of Jacob's 12 sons. One tribe's name absorbs the identity of a whole people, because one tribe was the one still standing when history finished shaking everyone else loose. There's a Hebrew word for that surviving fragment, shearit, the remnant. The prophets used it constantly. Not everyone is lost. Not everything is destroyed. Something small always makes it through. Now, here's where I keep my promise to you. Remember Dan, the tribe that couldn't hold its land and migrated north, the tribe that renamed a whole city after itself out of sheer stubbornness? Turn to the book of Revelation, written more than 1,000 years after Jacob first spoke his blessings, and you'll find a list of the 12 tribes, sealed with God's protection in a vision of the end of the world. Reuben is there, Gad is there, even Levi, who never had land of his own, is there, but Dan is missing. In its place, Manasseh gets listed twice, once through Joseph directly and once by name, as though the writer had to fill the gap Dan left behind. Scholars have argued about why, for 2,000 years, early church tradition even linked Dan to idolatry, pointing back to those golden calves set up in the city of Dan generations earlier. Nobody can prove exactly why the name disappears, but it does. The tribe that once picked itself up and walked north, rather than stay defeated, becomes, centuries later, the one tribe that gets left off the list entirely. That's the strange, quiet fate of Israel's 12 sons. Some conquered a homeland. One conquered an empire's imagination and became a whole people's name. One got written out of the final list, and 10 simply walked east into history, so large it swallowed them whole, and, according to at least one eyewitness historian, kept multiplying out there, unseen, for centuries afterward. So where are they now? Here's the honest answer, and it's less tidy than you might want. Most historians believe the 10 northern tribes assimilated into the populations around them within a few generations of exile, their identity dissolving the way water dissolves into a larger river, not destroyed exactly, but no longer distinguishable. But the story never quite died. Communities across the world, from the B'nai Menashe of northeastern India to the Beta Israel of Ethiopia to the Samaritans still living today on Mount Gerizim in the West Bank, descendants, they claim, of Ephraim and Manasseh, worshipping according to laws older than the Babylonian exile itself, have all, at different points in history, claimed a thread connecting them back to those 10 scattered names. You cannot prove most of those claims with certainty, but you also cannot prove they're wrong. That tension between a history that says assimilated and a hope that says still out there has never fully resolved, not in Josephus's century and not in ours. Which brings you to the 3 things worth carrying out of this story. First, promise and fracture are not opposites. Jacob's blessing didn't prevent his sons from splitting into rival, sometimes warring nations. It simply outlasted the fracture. The scepter promised to Judah survived a civil war, an Assyrian invasion, and a Babylonian exile, and it was still standing when a child was born in Bethlehem centuries later. Second, being scattered is not the same as being erased. Levi lost its land and became the priesthood woven through every other tribe. Judah lost its throne, and gave its name to an entire people. Even the 10 lost tribes, according to a man who lived among the empire that scattered them, were never actually gone, just too vast to count. And third, the one worth sitting with the longest. History keeps a shorter list than God apparently does. 12 sons stood around a dying man's bed. 19 centuries later, a vision in Revelation lists 12 tribes again, minus one name and plus a repeat. Imperfect, incomplete, and still called 12. Maybe that's the real ending to this story. Not that every tribe made it home, but that the number 12, battered and rearranged and missing a name nobody can fully explain, refused to disappear. If a story like this is worth telling, it's worth remembering. Subscribe if you want more of these. Every prophecy, every patriarch, every promise explained. And if you've got a theory about where Dan actually went, put it in the comments, because 2,000 years of scholars still haven't agreed on the answer. 12 brothers, one blessing, a promise that outlived every empire that tried to erase it.